In a small town called Chazy, near Bakhmut, in eastern Ukraine, something happened that should scare anyone who understands war. Russian soldiers received a simple order. They were supposed to attack positions where Ukrainian soldiers were entrenched. But there was a problem. They would have to do it without tanks and without artillery support, basically running straight into enemy guns. That's when their commander said something frightening. Anyone who didn't attack would be executed. They had no choice. It was the difference between dying right there or having a chance to fight and survive. Then, something surprising happened. The soldiers decided to do something unthinkable. They killed their own commander and then surrendered to the Ukrainians. Now you might be thinking, okay, desperate soldiers end up doing things like that. This has happened before. But this isn't an isolated case of desperate people. This case shows something much more serious that's happening inside the Russian army right now. Military experts have an expression to describe exactly this situation. They call it a hollow force. It's like an eggshell. On the outside, it looks solid and strong, but inside, it's completely empty. If you touch it with a little force, everything falls apart. And that brings us to an intriguing question. How did one of the largest armies in the world end up in this state? And well, the answer is going to surprise you, because it starts with something that most people didn't even notice when it happened. You see, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it had about 900,000 active soldiers. Of those, the most important were the so-called kontraktniki. These are the professional career soldiers. These guys knew how to use complicated equipment, how to coordinate attacks, how to work as a team. They were the true core of the Russian army. But then disaster struck. In the first months of the war, especially when they tried to take Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, most of these experienced soldiers were killed or seriously wounded. In just a few weeks, Russia lost what had taken decades to train. And this is where things start to snowball downhill. Desperate, Russia decided to replace these professionals by calling ordinary civilians into the army. We're talking about people who received just 1 week of military training before being sent to face Ukrainian soldiers who had already been fighting for months. And do you want to know what the result was? A cycle that keeps getting worse. Poorly trained soldiers can only carry out basic attacks, and disorganized. These basic attacks cause many deaths. These deaths force the army to call up even more poorly trained civilians, and the cycle keeps getting worse. The numbers are staggering. The Ukrainians say that Russia has already lost 1 million soldiers, both dead and wounded, by June of this year. Even the Americans, who tend to be more conservative, talk about 750,000 casualties by March. Just so you have an idea, that's more people than Russia has lost in any war since World War II. And here's a fact that's going to leave you speechless. You may have heard that Russia is making advances inside Ukrainian territory, but did you know that in many of these areas, they're only advancing about 50 meters per day? And if they keep going at this pace, it will take them 230 years to occupy all of Ukraine. Keeping the same proportions as so far, that would mean sacrificing 100 million Russian soldiers. And that's more people than all the adults Russia has today. Meanwhile, something even more devastating was happening. The Russian army was literally losing the ability to organize itself. More than 5,000 Russian officers have already died in the war, including at least 12 generals. Now you might be thinking, okay, but officers always die in wars. Yes, that's true. The problem is that every officer killed takes years of experience and knowledge with him. It's as if the army is gradually losing its memory. The units start to forget how to function properly. Ukraine realized this and started doing something really smart. They started specifically targeting Russian commanders with precision strikes. The idea is simple: kill the commander and create total confusion in the enemy unit. But there is something even more fundamental that is destroying the Russian army from within. The problem lies in the way they organize everything. The Russian military system comes from the time of the Soviet Union, where everything was decided at the top and everyone below just obeyed. That's how it works. The generals make the plans, send the orders down, and the soldiers have to obey without question, even if they see that the plan won't work. That might have worked in old wars, but nowadays it's a recipe for disaster. And the reason for that is simple. Now, there's something called a drone. These small unmanned planes with cameras can see everything that's happening on the battlefield in real time. Ukraine has thousands of them flying all the time, watching every move the Russians make. So imagine the situation. The Russians make a plan to attack a specific place, but the Ukrainian drones have already seen everything. They already know exactly what the Russians are going to do. And they get ready to receive them. When the Russian soldiers arrive, it's an ambush. But they can't change the plan, because the system doesn't allow it. It's like playing poker with your cards facing up. The opponent always knows what you're going to do before you do. And that brings us to the scariest aspect of this war. The modern battlefield has become completely transparent. Russian soldiers are not being sent to fight other soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. They are being sent to survive while invisible drones watch them from the sky, ready to strike at any moment. Research shows that 70% of Russian equipment destroyed in the war was hit by drones. It's very likely that something similar will happen to the soldiers. Imagine the psychological terror. You know you can be watched and attacked at any moment, but you can't see where the threat is coming from. The Ukrainians understood this and created something very smart. They made a project called I Want to Live. It's basically a communication channel that teaches Russian soldiers how to surrender safely. They promise humane treatment and even the possibility of staying in Ukraine after the war. This project doesn't try to convince happy soldiers to switch sides. It offers a way out for soldiers who are already at their limit. People who are trapped between obeying a suicidal order or being killed by a Ukrainian drone. More and more Russian soldiers are choosing the third option, surrendering. But to understand why so many soldiers are making this choice, you need to know a very disturbing truth about who is really fighting this war. Instead of calling up people from all over the country equally, as would happen in a real war, the Russian government did something very different. They focused mainly on poor regions and ethnic minority groups, while protecting the big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. The numbers are shocking. In the Republic of Buryatia, a poor region in the interior of Russia, 66 soldiers died for every 100,000 inhabitants. In Dagestan, another poor region, there were almost 23 deaths per 100,000 people. But in Moscow, the capital, there were only 3.6 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. This means that a young man from Buryatia is almost 20 times more likely to die in this war than a young man from Moscow. If you were a soldier and found this out, what would you think? Well, you'd probably come to the conclusion that your life is worth less to the government than the life of someone who lives in the capital. And when a soldier realizes he's being treated as disposable to protect the privileged classes, something changes in his mind. He stops fighting for Russia as an abstract idea and starts fighting just to survive. This whole strategy of mainly using the poor to fight is creating another huge problem. The war is bankrupting the country. Russia is spending 40% of all its public money on the war. Just the soldiers' salaries account for more than 8% of the entire government budget. At the same time, Western economic sanctions are cutting oil and gas revenues, which normally make up almost half of the Russian government's income. To make matters worse, more than 900,000 Russians, many of them skilled professionals, have already left the country. It's a cycle that doesn't stop. The more soldiers Russia loses, the more money it needs to spend to convince others to enlist. The more it spends, the less money it has to keep the country running. The worse the economy gets, the more qualified people leave. And this whole crisis forced Russia to do something that shows just how desperate it is. It started importing soldiers from other countries. Take the case of North Korea, which is now a strong ally of Russia. Kim Jong-un sent soldiers and ammunition several times to die on the front lines. Iran also sent its drones and fighters. This might seem like an easy solution to the problem, but it actually created several problems for Russia. Stop and think. How hard must it be to make an army work with soldiers from different countries? A real nightmare. They don't speak the same language. They weren't trained the same way. They don't know the same tactics.
By the order of the head of state.
According to the Republic.
The armed squads consider Russian territory as their own homeland's territory, and these officers, the army of the Korean people,
shoulder to shoulder with Russian servicemen.
There have already been at least 2 cases where North Korean soldiers mistakenly shot at Russian and Chechen soldiers, killing their own allies. Imagine trying to coordinate an attack when half of your people don't understand what you're saying. And the fact that Russia is paying for this help with advanced military technology shows how desperate it is. They're literally giving away their best weapons in exchange for problematic soldiers. All of this that I've laid out here brings us back to the soldiers of Chazy we talked about at the beginning. Those men who killed their commander were not simply cowards. They are, in fact, the expected result of all these things happening at the same time. They were poorly trained soldiers, commanded by inexperienced officers, trapped in a rigid system that didn't let them think, terrified by drones that could kill them at any moment, knowing that their own government considered them disposable, fighting alongside foreigners with whom they could barely communicate. As you can see, this incident puts President Putin in an impossible situation. He has 3 options, and all of them are bad. First option, to continue the war as it is. But that means more collapses like the one in Chazy and an economy that can't take it anymore. Second option, to stop the war. But that would mean publicly admitting defeat. Third option, try to negotiate. But how can you negotiate when your own troops are killing commanders? Each choice leads to more problems. There is no easy way out, and that brings us to the most important truth of this whole story. What makes an army work is not the number of tanks, planes, or soldiers. It's the willingness of those soldiers to obey orders and fight for something they believe in. Russia is suffering heavy losses on the battlefield precisely because of this. As the case of Chazy clearly shows, it is losing the one thing no army can afford to lose: the willingness of its soldiers to follow orders from a system that values them. And when an army loses that, it doesn't matter how many foreign soldiers you bring in or how much money you spend. What you have is no longer a real army, It's just an empty shell that can easily collapse. And you, what do you think about it? Do you believe that Russia will be able to sustain this situation for much longer? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this content helped you understand the current situation of the war, subscribe to the channel and share it with those who need to know what's really happening in Eastern Europe. See you next time.